Hello. Tonight, we do not journey to a distant, frozen past, but to a world of sun-baked stone and vibrant life, a world that existed in a single now famous moment in time. You will walk the paved streets of a bustling Roman city, hear the echoes of its daily commerce, and feel the warmth of a Mediterranean morning, all under the shadow of a mountain that was, until that day, simply a part of the beautiful landscape. This is the story of the final, ordinary hours before an ancient world was silenced. Before starting this video, which is only for you, relaxing and helping you sleep by clearing your mind, it would be a great support to us if you wrote where and when you watched it in the comments and subscribed. The night Pompeii realized the mountain wasn't just smoke, the final hours before Vesuvius. The day began in a manner that was entirely unremarkable, its rhythms and routines dictated by a pattern that had been established over many centuries of prosperous and largely predictable existence. In the Roman city of Pompeii, nestled in the fertile plains of Campania on the Italian coast, the morning of the 24th of August in the 79th year of the Common Era unfolded with the familiar cadence of commerce and domestic life. The sun, rising over the Sarno plain, first illuminated the upper slopes of the great mountain that loomed over the city, a feature of the landscape so constant and so benevolent that it was considered little more than a backdrop for the vibrant human activity at its base. This mountain, Vesuvius, was not seen as a threat but as a source of the region's wealth, its volcanic soil yielding some of the finest grapes and olives in the entire Roman world, its gentle, green slopes dotted with the luxurious villas of the wealthy elite who were drawn to the beauty and tranquility of the Bay of Naples. The morning air carried the usual mixture of scents, the sharp, salty aroma of the sea, the sweet smell of baking bread from the city's more than 30 bakeries, and the pervasive, pungent odor of garum, the fermented fish sauce that was a staple of the Roman diet and a major local industry. The sounds were those of a prosperous city awakening. The iron-rimmed wheels of delivery carts rumbled over the large, raised paving stones of the streets, their passage confined to the early morning hours to keep the thoroughfares clear for pedestrians later in the day. The shouts of merchants setting up their stalls in the bustling forum, the central hub of all civic, commercial, and religious life, echoed off the colonnades of the temples and the basilica. In the workshops that lined the city's main streets, the sounds of industry began, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rhythmic slap of the fuller's mallet on wet wool, the quiet scrape of a potter's tool on clay. For the approximately 12,000 inhabitants of Pompeii, this was a world that felt stable, orderly, and deeply rooted in the past. The city was a blend of cultures, a place where the old Oscan traditions of the original Samnite inhabitants were overlaid with the more dominant customs and architectural styles of their Roman conquerors. The walls of the city's public buildings and private homes were covered in a vibrant and often chaotic layer of painted advertisements and political graffiti, a testament to a lively and engaged civic life. The city was still, in many ways, a construction site. A severe earthquake 17 years prior, in the year 62, had caused extensive damage, toppling temples, cracking walls, and disrupting the city's sophisticated water supply system, which was fed by a long aqueduct. The intervening years had been a period of extensive rebuilding and renovation. The evidence of this ongoing recovery was everywhere. In the scaffolding that still clung to the side of the Temple of Isis, in the stacks of new roof tiles waiting to be installed, and in the fresh plaster that covered the repaired walls of many of the grander villas. This shared experience of the great earthquake had left a deep impression on the collective memory of the populace, but it had also, in a way, created a sense of resilience. They had survived a major natural disaster, they had rebuilt, and the city was once again thriving. The memory of the earth shaking was a familiar one, a known and understood danger of the region, and this very familiarity would have informed their interpretation of the minor tremors that were a not infrequent occurrence. Life was, for all intents and purposes, back to normal. The taverns, or thermopolia, were preparing for the midday rush, their counters displaying the hot food and drinks that would be served to the city's workers. In the grand, peristyle gardens of the wealthy, slaves were tending to the fountains and the carefully manicured plants, while their masters prepared for a day of business in the forum or a leisurely afternoon at the public baths. There was no sense of impending doom, no shadow of a great catastrophe hanging over the city. There was only the mundane, reassuring, and entirely normal progression of another late summer day in a prosperous corner of the Roman Empire. The preceding days, and indeed the very morning of the eruption itself, had been punctuated by a series of subtle environmental cues that, in retrospect, can be understood as clear precursors to the impending catastrophe, yet at the time, they would have been perceived as a disconnected series of minor and largely insignificant anomalies. The people of Pompeii and the surrounding region of Campania were no strangers to the movements of the earth. The memory of the powerful earthquake of 17 years prior was still fresh, and the smaller, less destructive tremors that had occurred in the intervening years were a familiar, if unsettling, feature of life. In the days leading up to the 24th of August, the frequency and intensity of these small earth tremors or foreshocks had noticeably increased. These would not have been violent, destructive quakes, but rather a series of brief, low-frequency shudders, just strong enough to be perceptible. A resident sitting in their atrium might have felt a slight vibration through the floor, seen the water in the central impluvium ripple for a moment, or heard the faint rattling of pottery on a shelf in the kitchen. For a population that had become habituated to such minor seismic activity, these events would not have been a cause for widespread alarm. They would have been interpreted through the lens of their past experience, seen as echoes of the Great Quake, as the normal settling of the earth, an inconvenience and a topic of casual conversation, but not as a herald of a new and entirely different kind of threat. The human mind has a powerful capacity for normalization, for fitting new and ambiguous data into existing and familiar frameworks, and the tremors were easily accommodated by the prevailing understanding that this was simply an earthquake-prone region. In addition to the tremors, there is strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that other, more subtle environmental signals were present. Ancient sources, when describing other major seismic and volcanic events, frequently make reference to the unusual behavior of animals in the hours and days before the disaster. It is a reasonable inference that the animal population around Vesuvius would have been similarly affected by the geological stresses building deep within the earth. Birds, more sensitive to the release of subterranean gases and to subtle changes in the Earth's magnetic field, may have fallen silent or been seen flying in unusually agitated patterns. Livestock in the farms that dotted the slopes of the mountain and the surrounding plain, such as sheep and cattle, would have become restless and difficult to manage. Dogs, with their acute sense of hearing, may have barked incessantly at low-frequency sounds that were inaudible to their human masters. While a single instance of such behavior might have been dismissed, a cumulative pattern of widespread and unusual animal agitation might have been noticed by the more observant inhabitants, particularly those who lived and worked in the countryside, their livelihoods dependent on a close and constant observation of the natural world. However, even this would have been ambiguous information, a collection of unsettling anecdotes rather than a clear and undeniable warning. Another significant precursor would have been the disruption of the local hydrology. The swelling of the magma chamber deep beneath the volcano would have caused the ground to deform, fracturing the rock and altering the pathways of the groundwater. The sophisticated aqueduct that supplied Pompeii and the other towns of the bay with fresh water may have experienced a noticeable drop in its flow rate. More dramatically, the springs and wells that dotted the landscape and those within the city itself would have behaved erratically. Some may have suddenly run dry, while others may have produced water that was warmer than usual or tainted with a faint, sulfurous smell. The water level in the city's many public fountains might have fluctuated without any apparent cause. These were tangible, physical signs that the deep plumbing of the earth was being subjected to immense and unusual pressures. For the inhabitants, however, these phenomena would have been difficult to interpret. A dry well could be attributed to the heat of the late summer, and a strange taste in the water could be dismissed as a temporary and localized issue. There was no scientific framework available to them that could have connected these disparate and subtle events, the tremors, the agitated animals, the failing springs, into a single coherent and terrifying narrative. They were a collection of isolated puzzles, minor disruptions to the predictable order of things, but they had not yet coalesced into a clear and present danger. The great mountain continued to stand silent and green against the blue sky, offering no obvious sign of the catastrophic transformation that was about to begin. The series of subtle and disconnected environmental anomalies that had marked the preceding days culminated, at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, in a sudden and truly terrifying event that definitively shattered the mundane normality of the day and marked the formal beginning of the eruptive sequence. Without any further warning, a deafening, explosive roar, a sound of immense and terrifying power, erupted from the summit of Vesuvius. This was the sound of the phreatomagmatic explosion that initiated the Plinian phase of the eruption, the moment when the immense pressure that had been building deep within the volcano catastrophically overcame the strength of the rock that had been containing it. This was not the sound of a normal earthquake, but something entirely new and profoundly alarming. It was a sound that would have been heard with terrifying clarity not only in Pompeii, but in all the towns and villas scattered around the Bay of Naples. A thunderous, ground-shaking concussion that would have instantly frozen every man, woman, and child in place, their heads instinctively turning towards the source of the impossible noise. Immediately following this initial explosive report, the very summit of the mountain, a feature of the landscape that had been solid and unchanging for as long as anyone could remember, appeared to tear itself apart. A vast and dense column of gas, pulverized rock, and superheated ash was blasted vertically into the sky with incredible force, an incandescent jet of the Earth's molten interior ascending at supersonic speeds into the upper reaches of the atmosphere. For the stunned onlookers in the streets and houses of Pompeii, this was a sight that was entirely outside their realm of experience and comprehension. There was no existing cultural or scientific framework that could have provided an immediate and accurate explanation for what they were witnessing. Their mythology was filled with stories of the anger of the gods, of the raw and unpredictable power of the supernatural world, and it is highly likely that their first, instinctive interpretation of this event would have been a religious one, a belief that they were witnessing a terrifying manifestation of divine power. The visual spectacle would have been one of both terrible beauty and profound dread. The ascending column, a roiling, turbulent mass of dark gray and black material, was shot through with flashes of volcanic lightning, a product of the intense static electricity generated by the friction of the countless tiny rock fragments colliding with one another. As the column reached the upper, less dense layers of the atmosphere, its vertical momentum began to wane, and it started to spread out horizontally, its shape changing from that of a straight, narrow pillar into something that one young eyewitness, observing from a safe distance across the bay at Misenum, would later famously and accurately describe as resembling a Mediterranean stone pine tree. It had a long straight trunk that rose to a great height, and then it spread out into a series of great billowing branches, forming a vast, dark and ever-expanding umbrella of ash and gas that began to blot out the sun. The initial reaction on the ground in Pompeii would have been one of mass confusion, of stunned disbelief giving way to a rising tide of panic. The initial explosion would have generated a powerful air pressure wave that would have rattled doors and windows, and the ground would have continued to be shaken by a continuous and violent tremor, a seismic roar that was the acoustic signature of the immense volume of magma forcing its way to the surface. People who had been indoors would have rushed out into the streets and open spaces to see what was happening, their faces turned upwards towards the terrifying spectacle in the sky. Others, caught in the narrow, stone-paved streets of the city, would have found their view obscured by the tall, multi-story insulae or apartment blocks, and would have been caught in a confusing and chaotic press of bodies as people tried to move towards the more open spaces of the forum or the amphitheater to get a clearer view. In these first few minutes, there would have been no clear consensus on what to do. Some, driven by a primal instinct for self-preservation, may have immediately begun to flee, grabbing their most valuable possessions and their family members and heading for the city gates. Others, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, or perhaps believing that this was a temporary and localized event, would have hesitated, choosing to take shelter in their homes or to seek refuge in the perceived sanctity of the temples, hoping to wait out the event and to appease whatever angry god they believed to be responsible. The city's authorities, the local magistrates, would have been completely overwhelmed, their institutional capacity for maintaining order utterly shattered by the sheer scale and unprecedented nature of the crisis. There was no evacuation plan, no established procedure for dealing with an event of this magnitude. Every individual and every family was thrown back upon their own resources, forced to make a life-or-death decision in a situation of profound and terrifying uncertainty, all under the shadow of the colossal, darkening cloud that was beginning to spread across the sky, slowly and inexorably turning the bright summer afternoon into a premature and unnatural twilight. As the colossal eruptive column continued to disgorge its contents into the upper atmosphere, the second and more protracted phase of the disaster began to unfold, a phase that would seal the fate of Pompeii and transform it from a living city into a buried tomb. The vast, umbrella-shaped cloud of ash and pumice, now spread over a wide area and laden with an immense weight of volcanic material, began to be acted upon by the prevailing high-altitude winds, which on that particular day were blowing from the northwest. This seemingly random meteorological fact was a death sentence for the cities of Pompeii and Stabiae, which lay directly to the southeast of the volcano. The dark, ominous cloud, which had been a terrifying but distant spectacle, now began to drift directly over the city, and a new and terrifying phenomenon began, the fallout of lapilli. This was not a gentle shower of fine dusty ash, but a relentless, heavy, and physically punishing rain of small, lightweight, and highly porous volcanic rocks known as pumice. These fragments, ranging in size from small pebbles to larger, fist-sized stones, were pieces of the frothy, gas-filled magma that had been violently ejected from the volcano, and they began to fall from the sky in immense and ever-increasing quantities. The initial moments of this fallout would have been more strange than dangerous, a sparse and scattered pattering of light, gray stones on the rooftops and the paving stones of the street. However, the intensity of the fall quickly and dramatically increased, transforming into a dense and continuous downpour of abrasive, solid material. For the inhabitants of Pompeii, this was a new and entirely unexpected form of attack from the heavens. The air, which moments before had been clear, was now filled with a thick, choking and ever-darkening curtain of falling debris. The sky was no longer visible, the sun was completely obscured, and the world was plunged into a profound and terrifying darkness, a blackness that was deeper and more absolute than that of a moonless night, a darkness that was filled with the constant, unnerving and percussive sound of the falling stones. The stones themselves, while individually light, were falling from a great height and with considerable velocity, and they were numerous enough to be dangerous. Anyone caught out in the open without some form of protection would have been subjected to a painful and potentially injurious bombardment. People would have instinctively tried to protect their heads with their hands, with pieces of cloth, or with whatever objects they could find, such as wooden tablets or ceramic roof tiles. The psychological impact of this event would have been immense. To be plunged into complete darkness in the middle of the afternoon, to be subjected to a continuous rain of stones from an unseen source, and to breathe an air that was becoming thick with a choking, sulfurous dust, would have felt like the end of the world, a descent into a mythological underworld. This relentless fall of pumice also began to have a significant and destructive effect on the physical infrastructure of the city. The material began to accumulate on every flat surface, forming a thick, gray and ever-deepening blanket of volcanic debris. At first, this was a mere inconvenience, but as the eruption continued hour after hour with no sign of abating, the sheer weight of the accumulating pumice began to pose a serious structural threat. The flat or gently sloping terracotta-tiled roofs of the city's houses and public buildings were not designed to support such a heavy and unusual load. The pumice, being highly porous, would have also absorbed any moisture in the air, further increasing its weight. After several hours of continuous fallout, the accumulation would have reached a depth of several centimeters, and the strain on the heavy timber-framed roofs would have become critical. The first signs of structural failure would have been the creaking and groaning of the wooden beams, and then, with a sudden splintering crash, the first roofs would have begun to collapse, sending a deadly avalanche of heavy tiles, wooden beams, and suffocating pumice down into the rooms below. For those who had chosen to take shelter inside their homes, believing it to be the safest option, this represented a new and terrible danger. The sanctuary of the home had become a trap, and the very structure that was meant to provide protection was now threatening to become the instrument of their death. The city was being simultaneously buried from above and crushed from within, a slow, relentless, and suffocating process that would continue without pause for many hours to come. As the relentless downpour of pumice and ash continued to accumulate, hour after agonizing hour, the physical environment within the city of Pompeii was transformed into a landscape that was both surreal and lethally dangerous. The initial phase of stunned confusion and panicked indecision had, for a significant portion of the population, given way to the grim and determined business of attempting to escape. The decision to flee, however, was not a simple one, and it was fraught with its own set of immense and constantly evolving challenges. The complete and unnatural darkness that had enveloped the world was the first and most disorienting of these obstacles. It was a darkness so profound that it rendered vision almost useless, a sensory deprivation that would have massively amplified the sense of fear and helplessness. To navigate the familiar streets of one's own city in such conditions would have been an almost impossible task. People would have been forced to feel their way along the walls of buildings, to call out to one another, their voices muffled by the constant percussive sound of the falling lapilli. The only sources of light would have been the flickering, unreliable flames of torches or oil lamps, their weak and smoky glow doing little to penetrate the thick, choking and dust-laden air, their light reflecting eerily off the swirling ash, creating a confusing and claustrophobic visual field. This darkness turned the familiar geography of the city into a terrifying and unknown labyrinth. The ground underfoot was no longer the hard, predictable surface of the stone-paved streets, but a soft, unstable and ever-deepening blanket of pumice. With each passing hour, the fallout continued to accumulate at a steady and terrifying rate, perhaps as much as 15 centimeters per hour. By the late afternoon, the streets would have been buried under a thick layer of these lightweight, abrasive stones, a landscape that was incredibly difficult and treacherous to move through. Walking on this surface would have been like trying to run on a beach of soft, deep and unstable sand. Each step would have required a huge and draining physical effort, the foot sinking deep into the shifting material. For the elderly, the very young, or those who were infirm, a sustained escape on foot in these conditions would have been an almost impossible feat of endurance. The pumice would have filled the deep ruts worn by cartwheels in the streets, hiding the large, raised stepping stones that were used to cross the thoroughfares, creating a landscape of hidden trip hazards. A fall in these conditions would have been disastrous, risking serious injury and making it incredibly difficult to get back up amidst the press of the panicked crowd and the continuous rain of stones from above. The air itself had become a toxic and hostile medium. The volcanic plume was not composed solely of inert rock fragments. It was also heavily charged with a mixture of noxious volcanic gases, primarily sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, and chlorine. While these gases were not yet present in the lethally high concentrations that would characterize the later phases of the eruption, they would have been noticeable and profoundly unpleasant. The air would have had a sharp, acrid, and sulfurous smell, a taste of metal and brimstone. Breathing this dust-laden and gas-tainted air would have become increasingly difficult. The fine, sharp-edged particles of volcanic ash, essentially microscopic shards of glass, would have irritated the eyes, the throat, and most dangerously the lungs. People would have been afflicted by fits of uncontrollable coughing as their respiratory systems struggled to expel the abrasive dust. They would have tried to cover their mouths and noses with pieces of cloth in a desperate and only partially effective attempt to filter the poisoned air. For those with pre-existing respiratory conditions such as asthma, these conditions would have been rapidly incapacitating. The physical exertion of trying to move through the deep pumice, combined with the increasingly compromised air quality, would have quickly led to a state of complete and utter physical exhaustion, a debilitating fatigue that would have made every single step a monumental struggle. The very act of survival had become a race against the depletion of one's own physical energy in an environment that seemed actively designed to sap it away. The path to the city gates, a walk that on a normal day would have taken only a matter of minutes, was now a grueling and life-threatening expedition that could take hours, if it could be completed at all. As the afternoon wore on and the situation within the walls of Pompeii became increasingly desperate, a silent and even more terrifying transformation was taking place high up on the slopes of the erupting volcano, a development that would unleash a new and far more lethal phenomenon upon the surrounding landscape. The colossal Plinian column, that great pine tree-shaped cloud that had been blasting material into the stratosphere for hours, was a fundamentally unstable structure. It was sustained by the sheer upward thrust of the gas-rich magma erupting from the vent, but as the eruption continued, the nature of that magma began to change, and the gas pressure at the source began to fluctuate and weaken. At several points during the long eruption, this upward thrust became insufficient to support the immense weight of the ash and rock suspended in the column above. When this happened, a portion of the column, or in some cases, the entire column itself, would have collapsed under its own immense weight, no longer rising into the sky but instead crashing back down to Earth. This collapsing material, a dense, superheated and gas-charged mixture of ash, pumice and incandescent rock, did not simply fall to the ground. Instead, it formed a terrifying, ground-hugging avalanche of hot gas and volcanic debris, a phenomenon known as a pyroclastic surge or flow. This was, in essence, a hurricane of incandescent ash, a turbulent, chaotic, and incredibly fast-moving density current that was heavier than air and which would race down the flanks of the volcano, following the contours of the landscape, and destroying everything in its path. The first of these surges, which occurred in the late evening, was a relatively small one. It was not powerful enough to travel the full distance to Pompeii, but it descended the western flank of Vesuvius and roared down into the coastal town of Herculaneum. The inhabitants of Herculaneum, a smaller and wealthier town than Pompeii, had been spared the heavy pumice fall that was burying their neighbors, due to their upwind location. Many of them, perhaps believing they were safe, had gathered on what they thought was the safety of the beach and in the large vaulted stone boat sheds that lined the shore. The arrival of the pyroclastic surge would have been almost instantaneous and utterly unsurvivable. The surge was not a slow-moving lava flow. It was a phenomenon that moved at hundreds of kilometers per hour, a blistering, suffocating cloud of gas and ash with a temperature of several hundred degrees Celsius. For the people huddled in the boat sheds, the end would have come in a matter of seconds. The intense, searing heat of the surge would have caused a near-instantaneous death from thermal shock, their bodies subjected to a temperature far beyond the limits of human endurance. The soft tissues would have been vaporized, and the bones themselves would have been subjected to extreme thermal alteration. This first surge was a harbinger, a demonstration of the new and far more deadly phase that the eruption had entered. It was a silent killer, an unstoppable and unimaginably destructive force that had now been unleashed upon the Bay of Naples. While this first surge did not reach Pompeii, its effects would have been indirectly perceptible within the buried city. The collapse of the column would have generated a powerful atmospheric pressure wave, a blast of hot wind that would have swept over the city, and it would have been accompanied by a deep, terrifying, rumbling sound, a sound different from the continuous roar of the main eruption. For the terrified survivors still struggling within Pompeii, huddled in their collapsing homes or trying to make their way through the deep pumice in the streets, this would have been yet another inexplicable and terrifying development in a day that had become a continuous nightmare. They would have had no way of knowing what this new sound signified, no way of understanding that the very nature of the threat had just fundamentally and catastrophically changed. The danger was no longer just the slow, suffocating burial by falling pumice. There was now a new, invisible and far more rapid agent of destruction on the move. As the eruption continued into the night, the Plinian column would collapse again, each time producing a new and more powerful pyroclastic surge. Each successive surge would travel further down the flanks of the volcano, a series of deadly, superheated waves pulsing outwards from the mountain, each one reaching further than the last, an incandescent tide that was slowly but surely advancing across the darkened and buried landscape, directly towards the city of Pompeii itself. As the long and terrifying day gave way to an even more horrific night, the situation for those who remained within Pompeii, whether by choice, indecision, or simply because they were physically unable to leave, entered its final and most desperate stage. The city was by now a profoundly alien and hostile landscape, buried under a layer of pumice and ash that, in some places, was already more than a meter deep. The continuous seismic activity that had accompanied the eruption from its outset had not abated. The very foundations of the city were being subjected to a constant, violent shuddering, a deep, resonant tremor that was the physical sensation of the volcano's immense and unceasing power. This constant shaking, combined with the ever-increasing weight of the accumulated volcanic debris, continued to take a catastrophic toll on the city's architecture. The sporadic and terrifying crashes of collapsing roofs, which had begun in the late afternoon, had by now become a more frequent and widespread phenomenon. Any building with a large, unsupported roof, such as the grand porticos of the Forum or the covered sections of the public baths, would have been particularly vulnerable. The collapse of these heavy timber-antile structures would have been sudden and total, creating localized pockets of absolute destruction and sending up great choking clouds of plaster and ash dust into the already unbreathable air. For the people who had taken refuge in these larger public buildings, hoping to find safety in their thick stone walls, this was a fatal miscalculation. The very solidity of the structures became their undoing, their massive roofs transformed into deadly deadfalls. The psychological conditions for the survivors would have been almost unimaginable. The absolute darkness, the suffocating dust-filled air, and the constant deafening noise, a hellish symphony composed of the continuous roar of the volcano, the percussive rain of falling stones, the terrifying crash of collapsing buildings, and the muffled cries of the injured and the dying, would have created a state of complete and utter sensory overload. In such conditions, rational thought would have been almost impossible, replaced by a primal and all-consuming terror. The human mind is not equipped to process a crisis of such a scale and duration. After many hours of this relentless assault on the senses, the survivors would have been in a state of profound physical and emotional exhaustion, their capacity for decision-making and coordinated action almost completely eroded. Many would have simply given up, resigning themselves to their fate and finding a place to huddle with their loved ones, seeking some small measure of comfort in their final moments. They would have retreated to the most interior and seemingly protected parts of their homes, crouching in the small windowless rooms under the stairs or in the subterranean cellars, or cantini, that were used for storing wine and food. In these dark, confined spaces, they would have waited, listening to the terrifying sounds of the world being unmade above them, their lamps eventually flickering out as the last of the oil was consumed, plunging them into a final, absolute darkness. For those who still possessed the strength and the will to attempt an escape, the challenges had become almost insurmountable. The pumice layer in the streets was now so deep that it would have reached an adult's waist in many places, making any kind of forward movement a slow, exhausting, and desperate struggle, more like swimming through a sea of abrasive rock than walking. The city gates, the only points of egress, would have been almost completely blocked by the deep drifts of accumulated pumice, their arched openings transformed into small, impassable tunnels of debris. The air quality had continued to deteriorate, the concentration of fine ash and acidic volcanic gases becoming ever more toxic. Every breath was a painful, rasping effort that brought a fresh dose of sharp, glassy particles into the already inflamed lungs. The final and most insidious danger in this phase was that of the falling debris dislodged by the constant tremors. The shaking of the earth would have sent loose roof tiles, pieces of decorative stonework, and chunks of plaster raining down into the narrow streets below, creating a constant and unpredictable hazard for anyone attempting to move through them. The world of Pompeii had been reduced to a series of lethal and inescapable traps. The open spaces were a suffocating desert of deep, unstable pumice, and the buildings were threatening to collapse at any moment. There was, by this point in the night, no safe place left in the entire city. The final hours of Pompeii were a slow, grinding, and inexorable process of attrition, a gradual extinguishing of the last pockets of life and hope under the immense and indifferent weight of the mountain. In the pre-dawn hours of the following day, after more than 12 hours of continuous eruptive activity, the final act of the tragedy was unleashed. High on the summit of Vesuvius, another, far more powerful collapse of the eruptive column occurred, generating the fourth and most destructive pyroclastic surge of the eruption so far. This surge was significantly larger and more energetic than the ones that had preceded it, and it possessed sufficient momentum to overcome the topographical obstacles that had slowed the earlier flows. It roared down the southeastern flank of the volcano at a speed of several hundred kilometers per hour, a turbulent, ground-hugging avalanche of superheated gas, ash, and incandescent rock, a glowing, unstoppable cloud of death. This was the surge that finally and catastrophically overwhelmed the city of Pompeii. its arrival would have been terrifyingly swift. For the few exhausted survivors still clinging to life within the buried city, the first and only sign of its approach would have been a sudden, intense blast of hot, hurricane-force wind, a searing gust that would have ripped the remaining tiles from the roofs and kicked up a blinding cloud of the fine ash that now covered everything. This was the turbulent, leading edge of the surge, the bow wave of the denser, hotter, and more lethal flow that was following just seconds behind it. There would have been no time to react, no time to even comprehend the nature of this new and final assault. The surge was not a fire in the conventional sense. It was a wave of pure, convected heat, a thermal pulse of extraordinary intensity. The temperature within the core of this pyroclastic surge was in excess of 300 degrees Celsius. For the human body, exposure to such a temperature, even for a fraction of a second, is instantly and comprehensively lethal. The primary cause of death for the last inhabitants of Pompeii was not suffocation from ash, as was long believed, but fulminant thermal shock. The intense heat would have caused an immediate and catastrophic failure of all vital organs. The lungs, seared by the superheated air and ash, would have hemorrhaged instantly, and the brain itself would have been subjected to a fatal and explosive increase in temperature. This was a death that was mercifully, almost unimaginably, quick. The victims would have been frozen in their final postures, their muscles contracting violently in a pugilistic spasm as a result of the extreme heat, their bodies falling where they stood in the streets, in the courtyards of their homes, or in the cellars where they had taken their final, futile refuge. The surge was a silent and indiscriminate killer, a wave of heat that instantly extinguished the last embers of life in the city, leaving behind only the still, silent forms of the dead. Immediately following this initial lethal thermal pulse, the main body of the pyroclastic flow, the denser and less turbulent current of hot ash and pumice, arrived. It poured into the city, flowing through the streets and alleyways like a great, gray and incandescent river, filling every open space, and burying everything in its path under another thick layer of hot volcanic material. It was this fine ash that would, in the end, become the agent of preservation. It flowed into the houses, filling the rooms from floor to ceiling, and it settled gently around the bodies of the dead, encasing them in a soft, fine-grained, and protective shroud. This layer of ash captured the final tragic moments of the city with a startling and poignant fidelity. It preserved the exact posture of the victims at the moment of their death, it captured the folds of their clothing, and it even, in some cases, preserved the terrified expressions on their faces. As this ash cooled and hardened over the subsequent hours and days, it formed a solid, cement-like shell around the bodies. Over the long centuries that followed, the soft tissues of the bodies decayed away, leaving behind a hollow void within the hardened ash, a perfect, three-dimensional negative mold of the person who had once been there. The city of Pompeii, which had been a vibrant and living community just one day before, was now a silent, monochrome and completely buried necropolis, its life and its death sealed beneath a thick and seamless blanket of volcanic earth, a forgotten tomb that would lie undisturbed and undiscovered for more than 1,600 years. The eruption was not yet over. Several more surges would sweep over the site in the hours to come, adding further layers to the tomb and ensuring that the city's final terrible secret would be kept safe from the world. The catastrophic sequence of pyroclastic surges that had swept through Pompeii in the early morning hours, instantly extinguishing all remaining life and burying the city under a thick, consolidating layer of hot ash, was not the final act of the eruption, but rather the climactic event in a much longer and more complex geological process. While the human story of Pompeii had reached its tragic conclusion, the volcano itself continued its violent activity for many more hours, a final, convulsive exhalation of the immense energy that had been pent up deep within the earth. Following the powerful surges that had inundated the city, the nature of the eruption continued to evolve. The remaining magma in the chamber, now largely depleted of its gas content, was less explosive, and the later phases of the eruption were characterized by the generation of even denser and less mobile pyroclastic flows, as well as significant ash fall that continued to blanket the wider region. These later flows added several more meters of volcanic material on top of the already buried city, further deepening its tomb and ensuring that its location would be completely obscured from the landscape. The final stages of the eruption were likely marked by the gradual collapse of the volcano's summit into the now emptied magma chamber beneath, a process known as caldera collapse, which would have dramatically and permanently altered the mountain's profile, leaving the large, semicircular depression that is still visible today. By the time the eruption finally ceased, likely on the morning of the 25th of August, approximately a full day after it had begun, the world had been profoundly and irrevocably changed. The immediate aftermath of the eruption was a scene of almost unimaginable desolation. The entire region to the southeast of Vesuvius, a landscape that had, just 2 days before, been one of the most fertile, prosperous and densely populated in the Roman Empire, was now a sterile, monochrome and silent desert. A vast, gray blanket of pumice and ash, in some places many meters thick, covered everything, smoothing over the familiar contours of the land and burying all signs of human habitation and agriculture. The cities of Pompeii and Stabii had vanished from the face of the earth, their locations marked only by a slight and ambiguous rise in the new, barren plain. The smaller town of Herculaneum was similarly entombed, not by pumice, but by an even deeper and more concrete-like deposit of fine pyroclastic surge material that had solidified into a dense, hard rock. The forests that had clothed the lower slopes of the mountain were gone, the trees either snapped off and carbonized by the surges or completely buried. The Sarno River, which had been a vital artery of commerce for Pompeii, was now choked with volcanic debris, its course permanently and dramatically altered. The very coastline of the Bay of Naples had been reshaped, with new land having been created by the immense volume of volcanic material that had poured into the sea. The air across the whole of southern Italy would have been thick with a fine gritty haze for many days, and the sun would have been obscured, casting an eerie dim light over the devastated landscape. For the survivors of the eruption, those who had been fortunate enough to have been in the upwind towns like Misenum and Naples, or those who had managed to escape from the doomed cities in the very first hours of the event, the world they now faced was a shattered one. They were refugees, dispossessed of their homes, their property, and in many cases their entire families. The historical record of the immediate official response to the disaster is sparse, but it is clear that the Roman state, under the Emperor Titus, did mount a significant relief effort. Titus himself is recorded as having visited the devastated region and appointed a special commission of senators to oversee the relief and reconstruction efforts. Public funds were allocated to assist the survivors and to begin the monumental task of clearing the roads and attempting to salvage what could be saved. However, the sheer scale of the devastation was simply too overwhelming. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were not just damaged, they were gone, buried under such a massive and intractable overburden of volcanic rock that any attempt at a systematic excavation or resettlement was deemed impossible. The land itself was rendered sterile and uninhabitable. Unlike the aftermath of an earthquake, where a city can be rebuilt on its old foundations, the eruption had created a completely new and alien landscape. The once fertile fields were now a barren wasteland, and the very memory of where the cities had once stood began to fade. The survivors were eventually resettled in other, undamaged towns in Campania, and the names of Pompeii and Herculaneum slowly began to disappear from the active consciousness of the Roman world, becoming little more than a historical footnote, a half-forgotten story of a local catastrophe in a distant and troubled past. The mountain, now quiet and shrouded in steam, had wiped the slate clean. The burial of Pompeii and the surrounding sites was so sudden, so total, and so complete that it created a unique and unintentional form of preservation, a catastrophic event that, paradoxically, resulted in the creation of one of the world's most valuable and revealing archaeological archives. The thick layers of pumice and fine ash that entombed the city did not just bury it, they protected it. This blanket of volcanic material shielded the city's buildings, its objects, and even the organic remains of its inhabitants from the destructive effects of the passage of time. For more than 16 centuries, the city lay in a state of suspended animation, safe from the ravages of weather, from the slow decay of biological processes, and, most importantly, from the continuous cycle of demolition and rebuilding that has obliterated the physical remains of almost all other Roman cities. In a normal city, old buildings are torn down to make way for new ones, objects are broken and discarded, and the material evidence of any single moment in time is quickly and thoroughly erased. In Pompeii, however, the clock had been stopped at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the 24th of August, 79, and the entire material reality of that moment was sealed in a near-perfect state of preservation. It was not a curated collection of a city's finest treasures, but a complete and unbiased cross-section of ordinary, everyday life, frozen in its final, chaotic moments. This unintentional act of preservation created a time capsule of unparalleled richness and detail, a direct and unfiltered window into the lived reality of the Roman world. The rediscovery of this lost world was a slow and accidental process. For centuries, the location of the buried city was a matter of vague and often inaccurate local legend. The area was known simply as La Civita, the city, and peasants tilling the new, fertile volcanic soil would occasionally turn up fragments of worked marble or ancient coins. The first systematic, albeit treasure-hunting focused, excavations began in the mid-18th century, under the patronage of the Bourbon monarchy that then ruled the Kingdom of Naples. Engineers, tunneling haphazardly through the dense, compacted volcanic material, began to uncover the remarkably preserved remains of the ancient city. They found houses with their walls still standing, often to the height of the second story, their interior surfaces covered in vibrant and beautifully preserved frescoes depicting scenes from mythology, from daily life and from the natural world. They found floors decorated with intricate mosaics, and gardens adorned with bronze and marble statues. They found the ordinary, everyday objects of Roman life, left exactly where they had been abandoned in the final moments of panic. Ceramic plates and cups on a kitchen counter, a carbonized loaf of bread still sitting in an oven, a set of surgical instruments on a table in a doctor's house, and the scattered coins that had been dropped by a fleeing resident. This process of rediscovery was, in itself, a revolution. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the understanding of the Roman world had been based almost entirely on the study of its literature and the monumental remains of its great public buildings in Rome itself. Pompeii offered something entirely new and far more intimate. It offered a glimpse into the private lives, the homes, the shops, and the streets of an ordinary Roman town. The graffiti that covered the walls, with its mix of political slogans, personal insults, and declarations of love, provided a direct and unfiltered voice from the past. The contents of the shops and workshops revealed the details of the Roman economy and its craft industries. The layout of the houses and their decorations provided a wealth of information about Roman social structure, domestic life, and artistic tastes. The sheer completeness of the evidence was transformative. It allowed historians and archaeologists for the first time to reconstruct an entire ancient urban ecosystem, from the grand villas of the elite to the cramped, rented rooms of the poor, and to understand how all the different parts of the city functioned together. The buried city, which had been a symbol of catastrophic destruction, was reborn as an unparalleled source of historical and archaeological knowledge, a place where the silent stones of the past could speak with a clarity and a detail that was found nowhere else in the world. The disaster that had ended a city's life had, in the long run, ensured its immortality. The initial haphazard explorations of the 18th century, which had been driven largely by a desire to recover valuable sculptures and other art objects for the private collections of the Bourbon monarchy, gradually gave way in the mid-19th century to a more systematic and scientific approach to the excavation of Pompeii. This transformation was spearheaded by a new generation of archaeologists who were less interested in treasure hunting and more concerned with the careful and methodical uncovering of the city as a complete social and historical artifact. The single most important and transformative development in this new phase of the city's rediscovery was a simple but brilliant innovation that, for the first time, allowed the human victims of the tragedy to emerge from the anonymity of the past and to be seen, in a sense, in their final, poignant moments. This technique, developed in the 1860s by the director of the excavations, an archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli, was a direct and ingenious response to a peculiar feature of the Pompeian archaeological record that had puzzled and frustrated earlier excavators. As they tunneled through the hardened layers of volcanic ash, the diggers would frequently encounter hollow spaces or voids within the compacted material. When these voids were broken into, they were often found to contain the jumbled and disarticulated remains of human skeletons. It was quickly realized that these cavities were, in fact, the final resting places of the victims of the eruption. The fine ash from the pyroclastic surges had solidified around their bodies, forming a perfect mold. Over the centuries, the soft tissues and clothing had decayed away, leaving behind a hollow, three-dimensional negative impression of the person, an empty space that preserved their exact posture and form at the moment of their death. Fiorelli's innovation was to treat these voids not as an obstacle to be cleared away in the search for skeletons, but as a unique archaeological feature to be carefully preserved and investigated. He developed a technique whereby, as soon as a void was discovered, the excavators would carefully clear an opening into it and then pour in liquid plaster of Paris, the same material used for making sculptural casts, filling the entire cavity. Once the plaster had been given sufficient time to harden, the surrounding shell of volcanic ash could be carefully chipped away, revealing a perfect and incredibly detailed plaster replica of the victim. This was not a reconstruction or an artist's impression. It was a direct, one-to-one cast of the space that the body had once occupied, a hauntingly accurate and three-dimensional photograph of a person in their final instant. The level of detail captured by this technique was astonishing. The casts revealed the folds of the victim's clothing, the sandals on their feet, the hairstyles of the women, and most powerfully of all, the very expressions of terror and agony that were etched on their faces. For the first time, the human tragedy of Pompeii was made visible and visceral. The anonymous skeletons were given a human form, and the abstract historical event was transformed into a collection of deeply personal and individual stories of suffering. The plaster casts revealed the human reality of the disaster in a way that no other form of archaeological evidence could. They captured entire family groups huddled together in a final, futile embrace. They showed a woman clutching a small child, her body arched over the infant in a protective but ultimately useless gesture. They revealed a man, perhaps a slave, whose arms were shackled, lying where he had fallen, unable to even attempt an escape. One of the most famous and poignant of these casts is that of a dog, left chained to a post in the house of the Orpheus, its body contorted in the agonies of suffocation, its legs twisted as it had struggled against its tether. Another cast, known as the muleteer, shows a man lying on his back, his knees drawn up, his face a silent scream of agony. These were not just archaeological artifacts. They were profoundly moving human documents, powerful and uncomfortable reminders of the real and terrifying experience of the individuals who had lived and died in the city. Fiorelli's technique was a paradigm shift in the history of archaeology, a move away from a focus on objects and architecture and towards a new and more humanistic concern with the lives and experiences of the people of the past. The casts of Pompeii became and remain to this day one of the most powerful and iconic symbols of the city's fate, a silent, gray, and incredibly eloquent chorus of witnesses to the last day of their world. The plaster casts, while being the most visually dramatic and emotionally resonant form of evidence for the human experience of the eruption, are just one component of a much broader and more complex field of modern scientific inquiry that seeks to reconstruct the biological and social realities of the Pompeian population. The skeletal remains themselves, the bones and teeth that are found within the plaster casts or excavated from the volcanic deposits, are a rich and detailed archive of information. Through the application of modern forensic anthropological and bioarchaeological techniques, these silent remains can be made to tell a remarkably detailed story about the lives of the individuals to whom they once belonged. The analysis of a skeleton can begin with the determination of the most basic biological facts. By examining the characteristic features of the pelvis and the skull, archaeologists can determine the sex of an individual with a high degree of accuracy. The age at which an individual died can be estimated by examining the degree of wear on their teeth, the stages of fusion of the long bones, and the degenerative changes in the joints, allowing for the reconstruction of the demographic profile of the victims. This has revealed that the eruption did not kill indiscriminately. The group of victims found within the city walls appears to be a non-random sample of the total population, with a disproportionately high number of women, children, and the elderly, suggesting that many of the able-bodied adult males may have been away from the city for work, or were perhaps more successful in making an early escape. Beyond these basic demographic data, the skeletons provide a wealth of information about the health, diet, and lifestyle of the Pompeian people. The analysis of skeletal pathologies, the marks left on the bone by disease and injury, reveals that the population was, in many respects, a relatively healthy one, but also one that was subject to the common afflictions of the pre-modern world. Evidence of healed fractures is common, attesting to the physical risks of daily life. Many of the older individuals show clear signs of osteoarthritis, particularly in the spine and the major joints, the result of a lifetime of physical labor. The teeth of the Pompeians are a particularly revealing source of information. While they show a surprisingly low incidence of dental caries or cavities, a likely result of a low-sugar diet, they do show an extremely high degree of dental wear. The surfaces of the teeth are often worn down flat, a condition caused by the presence of abrasive grit in their daily diet. This grit was not a natural contaminant, but was a byproduct of their food processing technology. It was the fine stone powder from the basalt millstones that were used to grind their grain into flour, a constant and unavoidable ingredient in their daily bread. The teeth also reveal evidence of periods of childhood stress, in the form of linear enamel hypoplasias, indicating that the seemingly prosperous life of the city was not free from episodes of disease or nutritional shortage. In recent years, the scientific analysis of these remains has entered a new and even more powerful phase with the application of advanced biochemical and genetic techniques. The chemical composition of the bones and teeth can be analyzed to reconstruct the diet of an individual in incredible detail. The stable isotope ratios of carbon and nitrogen preserved in the bone collagen can reveal the relative importance of marine versus terrestrial foods in an individual's diet, and can even distinguish between the consumption of different types of plants. This has confirmed that the Pompeian diet was a varied one, based on cereals, fruits, and vegetables, but also with a significant component of fish and other seafood, as would be expected for a coastal community. The most recent and groundbreaking development has been the successful extraction and analysis of ancient DNA from the skeletons of the victims. This genetic evidence is beginning to provide an unprecedented and deeply personal level of insight into the population. It can reveal the genetic ancestry of individuals, showing the complex mix of local Italian and other Mediterranean populations that made up the city. It can also be used to identify family relationships between individuals who died together, confirming, for example, that a group of people found huddled in a room of a villa were, in fact, a multi-generational family. This new science is transforming the skeletal remains from anonymous representatives of a lost population into identifiable individuals, each with their own unique life story, a story that is written in the very fabric of their bones. The remarkably complete and detailed picture of Roman urban life that has been painstakingly assembled from the archaeological and bioarchaeological evidence at Pompeii represents one of the most significant contributions to our modern understanding of the classical world. The city, in its preserved state, is not a monument to the great deeds of emperors and generals, but a testament to the complex, vibrant, and often messy reality of ordinary, everyday existence. It is a snapshot of a functioning urban system, a complex organism with a distinct social, economic, and physical structure. The physical layout of the city itself is the primary and most immediate source of this understanding. Pompeii was not a haphazard collection of buildings, but a planned and highly organized urban space, its structure a reflection of the social and political priorities of its inhabitants. The city was enclosed by a formidable defensive wall, a remnant of its earlier, more tumultuous history in the Samnite and early Roman periods, but by the 1st century these walls had become largely symbolic, their primary function being the control of the movement of people and goods through a series of monumental gates. The interior of the city was laid out on a rough grid plan, a characteristic feature of Roman urban planning, with a series of long, straight main streets or decumani running east-west, intersected by a series of smaller north-south streets, the Cardines. This rational and orderly street grid was the skeleton upon which the flesh of the city was built. The streets themselves were a marvel of practical engineering, paved with large, durable blocks of volcanic stone, and featuring a high central roadway for wheeled traffic, flanked by raised sidewalks for pedestrians. At regular intervals, large, raised stepping stones were placed across the street, allowing people to cross from one side to the other without having to step down into the central roadway, which also served as the city's primary drainage channel, a space that would have been frequently fouled by rainwater, wastewater, and the refuse of daily life. The heart of this urban organism, the central nexus of all its most important functions, was the Forum. This was a large, rectangular, and pedestrianized public plaza, enclosed on three sides by an elegant two-story colonnade. The Forum was the physical and symbolic center of the city, the space where all the major threads of Pompeian life, civic, religious, commercial, and social, came together. It was surrounded by the most important and imposing buildings in the city. At the northern end stood the imposing Temple of Jupiter, the principal temple of the city, dedicated to the supreme god of the Roman pantheon. Along the sides of the Forum were the other key institutions of Roman civic life: the Basilica, a large aisled hall that served as the city's law court and its primary center for business and financial transactions; the municipal offices, where the city's elected magistrates, the duumviri and the aediles, conducted their administrative duties; and the Macellum, the city's main public market, a bustling complex of small shops arranged around a central courtyard, where fish, meat, and vegetables were sold. The Forum was not just a collection of buildings, it was a dynamic and constantly changing social space. It was here that political candidates would make their speeches, that merchants would strike their deals, that citizens would gather to hear public announcements, and that friends would meet to exchange news and gossip. Its walls would have been covered with painted notices and graffiti, and its open spaces would have been filled with the honorific statues of prominent local citizens and members of the imperial family. To walk through the Forum was to be at the very heart of the city's public life. Radiating outwards from this civic core was a dense and complex tapestry of residential and commercial neighborhoods. The city was not strictly zoned in the modern sense. Residential houses, shops, workshops, and taverns were all mixed together in a vibrant and often chaotic urban fabric. The main commercial thoroughfares, such as the Via dell'Abbondanza, were lined with the open-fronted workshops and retail establishments that formed the backbone of the Pompeian economy. There were bakeries with their large, brick flour-grinding mills turned by donkeys and their domed, wood-fired ovens. There were the workshops of the cloth-makers or Philonici, with their complex series of basins for washing, dyeing, and treating woolen cloth. There were the workshops of metalsmiths, of potters, and of gem cutters. A particularly common and characteristic feature of the Pompeian streetscape was the thermopolium, a Roman version of a fast food counter. These were small L-shaped establishments with a masonry counter facing the street, into which were set a series of large earthenware jars, or dolia, that would have held a variety of hot, ready-to-eat stews, snacks, and mulled wine. These were the primary eating establishments for the city's less affluent population, for the workers, the travelers, and the residents of the small, kitchenless apartments who did not have the facilities to cook for themselves. The physical structure of the city, as revealed by the excavations, thus provides a detailed and nuanced map of its economic and social life, a map that shows a community that was not only a prosperous agricultural center but also a busy and productive hub of small-scale craft and manufacturing, and a place with a highly developed service economy that catered to the daily needs of its diverse population. The meticulously preserved residential architecture of Pompeii provides an unparalleled and deeply intimate insight into the structure of Roman society and the nature of the Roman family. The city contains a wide and representative spectrum of housing types, from the grand and sprawling villas of the wealthy, land-owning elite to the small, cramped, and often squalid rental apartments of the urban poor, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct the full social pyramid of a Roman town with a level of detail that is impossible to achieve anywhere else. The most famous and well-studied of these housing types is the classic Roman domus, or private house, the characteristic dwelling of the upper-middle and elite classes. This was not just a place to live, it was a carefully designed architectural stage, a semi-public space that was intended to display the wealth, the status, and the social connections or clientela of its owner, the paterfamilias. The typical domus was an inward-looking structure, presenting a largely blank and windowless facade to the street, its interior life hidden from the public gaze. The entrance, or fasces, would often be decorated with a mosaic, sometimes a protective image such as that of a fierce guard dog, accompanied by the words Cave Canem or Beware of the Dog. This entranceway led directly into the central and most public space of the house, the atrium. The atrium was a large, formal reception hall, open to the sky in the center through a rectangular opening in the roof known as the compluvium. Directly beneath this opening was a shallow, rectangular pool, the impluvium, which was designed to collect the rainwater that fell through the roof, channeling it into a subterranean cistern that provided the household with a private water supply. The atrium was the space where the owner would receive his business clients and his political dependents each morning, and its decoration was a direct reflection of his social standing. The walls would be covered in elaborate and colorful frescoes, and the room would be adorned with the family's most valuable furniture and with the wax portrait masks of his distinguished ancestors, the imagines, which were displayed in small, shrine-like cupboards. Surrounding the atrium were a series of small, private rooms, the cubicula, which served as bedrooms for the family. These were typically small, sparsely furnished, and often windowless, their primary function being simply a place to sleep. Beyond the atrium, a short passageway led to the more private and relaxed heart of the house, the peristyle garden. This was a colonnaded walkway that enclosed a small, formal garden, which was often elaborately landscaped with ornamental plants, fountains, and small statues. The peristyle was the center of the family's private life, a tranquil and secluded space that brought a piece of the idealized countryside into the heart of the urban home. The main dining room of the house, the triclinium, where the family would host its formal dinner parties, was typically located with a view overlooking this garden. The service areas of the house, such as the kitchen or culina, and the latrine, were usually small, dark, and tucked away in a corner, staffed by the household slaves who were the invisible engine of the domestic economy. This architectural division between the public high-status spaces of the atrium and the private, more leisurely spaces of the peristyle, and the stark contrast with the purely functional and marginal spaces of the slaves, is a direct, physical manifestation of the hierarchical and patriarchal structure of the Roman family and the wider Roman society. The Pompeian domus was not just a house. It was a carefully calibrated instrument for the performance of social status and the maintenance of social order. While the Grand Domus represents the idealized and most visible form of residential architecture in Pompeii, it was the dwelling of only a relatively small and privileged segment of the city's population. A careful and systematic analysis of the full range of the city's housing stock reveals a far more complex and crowded urban reality, a world in which the majority of the inhabitants lived in conditions that were markedly different from the spacious and elegant environment of the elite. The economic and social life of the city was heavily dependent on a large and diverse population of merchants, shopkeepers, craftspeople, laborers, and slaves, and the archaeological record of their living arrangements provides a crucial and often overlooked counterpoint to the more famous villas. One of the most common forms of non-elite housing was the small, street-fronting shop, or taberna, which often had one or two small residential rooms attached to the back or located on a cramped upper floor, or pergola, accessible by a steep wooden staircase. These were the combined homes and workplaces of the city's small business owners, the bakers, the potters, the weavers, and the tavern keepers. The living quarters in these establishments were typically small, dark, and lacking in the amenities that were standard in the larger houses. They would have had no private water supply, no bathing facilities, and no dedicated space for cooking, forcing their inhabitants to rely on the city's public fountains for their water and on the numerous street-fronting thermopolia for their hot meals. This was a life that was lived in public, its rhythms dictated by the opening and closing of the shop, and its social world centered on the bustling life of the street rather than the secluded privacy of a peristyle garden. An even larger and archaeologically more elusive segment of the population lived in rented rooms and apartments within larger, multi-story buildings known as insulae. While Pompeii did not have the towering, shoddily constructed tenement blocks that were a notorious feature of the imperial capital in Rome, it did have a significant number of these larger, residential commercial buildings, which were often owned by wealthy landlords and rented out to the city's less affluent residents. These buildings were typically centered around a large workshop or a grand domus, with the upper floors and the less desirable rooms being subdivided into small, individual rental units. Life in these apartments would have been crowded, noisy, and characterized by a complete lack of privacy. The rooms were small, and the construction was often of a much lower quality than that of the elite houses, with thin walls and flammable wooden floors and balconies. These were the homes of the urban working class, the dock workers, the construction laborers, the cloth dyers, and the vast population of urban poor who eked out a precarious existence on the margins of the city's economy. The lowest and most invisible stratum of Pompeian society was, of course, the slave population. Slaves were not considered people in a legal sense, but property, and their living conditions were a direct reflection of this status. In the larger, wealthier households, they would have slept in small, windowless and often Baroque-like cells, clustered around the service areas of the house, such as the kitchen and the stables. Their quarters were devoid of any personal decoration or comfort, their entire existence dedicated to the service and convenience of their masters. The archaeological evidence of these diverse and often difficult living conditions is a crucial corrective to the romanticized image of Pompeii, revealing a society that was highly stratified, with a vast and unbridgeable gulf between the luxurious and leisurely lives of the elite and the cramped, laborious and precarious existence of the majority of its inhabitants. The vibrant and colorful frescoes that adorn the interior walls of the houses of Pompeii are one of the most famous and visually stunning aspects of the city's archaeological remains, and they provide an unparalleled resource for understanding the aesthetic tastes, the cultural values, and the mythological world of the Roman people. The practice of painting the interior walls of a house was not a luxury reserved for the super-rich. It was a standard and expected feature of almost any respectable dwelling, a form of decoration that was as common and as necessary as having a roof. The quality and complexity of the paintings, however, varied enormously, ranging from the simple monochrome panels of a modest apartment to the vast, complex, and masterfully executed mythological scenes that covered the entire walls of the grand reception rooms in the wealthiest villas. This vast corpus of preserved Roman painting, which is almost completely lost from other sites, has allowed art historians to reconstruct the entire developmental sequence of the art form, which is conventionally divided into 4 distinct Pompeian styles that span the last 2 centuries of the city's life. The earliest style is characterized by the imitation of expensive colored marble blocks, a way of using painted plaster to create the illusion of a wall built from solid, luxurious stone. The second style, which became popular in the last century before the Common Era, moved away from this architectural imitation and opened up the wall with the creation of illusionistic, 3-dimensional scenes. These were often complex architectural vistas or mythological landscapes, painted with a sophisticated use of perspective to create the illusion that the viewer was looking out of a window into a deep and realistic space beyond the room. The third style, which was fashionable in the early 1st century, was a reaction against this illusionism, a move towards a more delicate, ornamental, and classical style. The walls were often painted in solid, monochrome fields of rich, dark colors such as black or red, upon which were painted small, jewel-like and exquisitely detailed miniature scenes, often floating in the center of the large panel, like a framed picture hanging on a modern wall. The final style, which was in vogue at the time of the eruption, was a more eclectic and theatrical mixture of the previous 2. It combined the illusionistic depth and architectural vistas of the second style with the large, flat color fields and ornamental details of the third, creating a busy, crowded, and often flamboyant decorative effect, a style that has been compared to the Baroque art of a much later period. The subject matter of these paintings was incredibly diverse. The grand, formal reception rooms of the house were typically decorated with large, complex panels depicting scenes from Greek and Roman mythology. These were not just pretty pictures, they were a form of cultural display, a way for the homeowner to demonstrate his education and his familiarity with the classical literary tradition. The choice of a particular myth was often a deliberate and meaningful one, intended to convey a message about the virtues or the lineage of the family. A scene depicting the bravery of Achilles or the piety of Aeneas was a way of aligning the owner of the house with these heroic and quintessentially Roman values. Alongside these mythological scenes, the paintings also depicted a wide range of other subjects. There were delicate still lifes showing bowls of fruit, glasses of wine, and the ingredients of a Roman meal. There were bucolic landscapes, idyllic and romanticized scenes of the countryside, populated by shepherds and their flocks. And in the less formal parts of the house, such as the peristyle gardens, there were often vast and detailed garden scenes, illusionistic paintings of plants, birds, and fountains that were designed to blur the boundary between the real, physical garden and the painted world on the wall, creating a sense of being completely immersed in a lush and verdant natural world. These paintings were the backdrop to Roman life, a constant and colorful visual environment that shaped the perceptions and the imaginations of the people who lived among them. Beyond the formal and often idealized world depicted in the grand mythological frescoes, the walls of Pompeii were also covered in another, more ephemeral and spontaneous form of visual and textual communication, a vast and chaotic collection of graffiti that provides one of the most direct and unfiltered windows into the minds of the ordinary literate and semi-literate inhabitants of the Roman world. In a society without cheap paper or widespread printing, the plaster-coated walls of public buildings and private houses served as a universal and ever-present public bulletin board, a shared space where the people of the city could leave their mark, express their opinions, and communicate with one another. The sheer quantity and variety of this graffiti is staggering. More than 11,000 individual inscriptions have been recorded in Pompeii alone, a number that is far greater than that from any other site in the Roman Empire, including Rome itself. These inscriptions were not carved into the stone, but were typically scratched into the soft, upper layer of the painted plaster with a sharp object, such as a nail or a stylus, or in the case of the more formal public notices, painted onto the walls in bold red or black letters by professional signwriters. This vast collection of informal writing provides a voice for the segments of Roman society: the women, the slaves, the tavern keepers, the artisans, whose thoughts and experiences are almost entirely absent from the formal literary texts that have survived from the period, which were written almost exclusively by and for a tiny, educated, male elite. The graffiti of Pompeii is the authentic and censored voice of the Roman street. The subject matter of this graffiti is as diverse as the population that produced it. A significant portion of the inscriptions are simple and personal, the ancient equivalent of a modern social media post. Individuals would scratch their names onto a wall to record their presence at a particular place, often accompanied by the date. Sometimes these are simple declarations of love: Marcus loves Spendusa, or Serena hates Isdromus. Other times they are more boastful or insulting. One famous piece of graffiti from the Basilica declares, "I am amazed, O wall, that you have not collapsed and fallen, since you are forced to bear the tedious scribblings of so many writers." The walls of taverns and brothels are, unsurprisingly, covered in a particularly rich and often crude collection of inscriptions, with patrons recording the quality of the service, the price of the wine, or their romantic and often exaggerated exploits. This informal, personal graffiti, while seemingly trivial, is an invaluable source of social historical data. It provides a vast and otherwise unobtainable database of common Roman names, and it offers a deeply humanizing glimpse into the everyday concerns, the friendships, the rivalries, and the romantic entanglements of the ordinary people of the city. Another major and historically more significant category of Pompeian graffiti is the political. In the years leading up to the eruption, the city was a vibrant and competitive democracy, with annual elections for the senior municipal offices. During the campaign season, the walls of the city would be covered in painted electoral notices, or programmata, which urged the citizens to vote for a particular candidate. These were not produced by the candidates themselves, but by their supporters, their clients, or by the various professional guilds and trade associations of the city. A typical notice might read, "The members of the Fishermen's Guild ask you to elect Papidius Rufus as aedile." These notices provide a detailed and fascinating insight into the mechanics of Roman local politics. They reveal the names of the politically active families, the importance of professional associations in mobilizing votes, and the kind of public virtues that were considered important in a candidate, who was often praised for being a good man or a worthy public servant. Alongside these formal notices are more informal and often more scurrilous pieces of political commentary, with individuals scratching their own, often highly critical, opinions about a candidate next to their official slogan. This gives a sense of the lively and sometimes vicious nature of Pompeian political debate. This graffiti is the most direct and compelling evidence we have for the active and engaged participation of ordinary citizens in the democratic life of a Roman city. The religious beliefs and practices of the Pompeian people, in all their complexity and diversity, are another area that is illuminated with unparalleled clarity by the city's archaeological remains. The formal, public religion of the city is most visible in the grand temples of the Forum and in the other major religious sanctuaries scattered throughout the city. The principal temple, as in all Roman cities, was the Capitolium, dedicated to the supreme triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the divine protectors of the Roman state. The public cults of these and other major Roman deities such as Apollo, the patron god of the city, and Venus, from whom the Pompeians believed they were descended, were managed by the city's magistrates and were supported by public funds. The great public festivals and sacrifices that punctuated the religious calendar were a key part of the city's civic identity, a way of reaffirming the community's relationship with the gods and ensuring their continued benevolence, or Pax Deorum. The archaeological evidence from these temples, however, also reveals the complex and syncretic nature of Roman religion. The Temple of Isis, for example, is a testament to the immense popularity of the so-called mystery cults, which had been imported from the eastern provinces of the empire. The cult of the Egyptian goddess Isis, with its elaborate rituals, its promise of a personal connection with the divine, and its offer of salvation and a blessed afterlife, held a powerful appeal, particularly for women and for the lower classes, and the beautifully preserved temple, with its underground chambers for initiation rites and its Egyptian-themed frescoes, is one of the most complete sanctuaries of the cult to be found anywhere in the world. Alongside these grand, public cults, the archaeological evidence from Pompeii provides an even more intimate and detailed insight into the private, domestic dimension of Roman religion. Every Roman house, from the grandest villa to the most humble apartment, had its own set of household gods, and its own dedicated space for their worship. The most important of these was the Lararium, the household shrine. This could range from a simple, painted niche in a wall to an elaborate, freestanding and temple-shaped structure, but it was a ubiquitous feature of the Pompeian home. The Lararium was dedicated to the worship of the household's own, personal protective deities. These included the Lares, the spirits of the family's ancestors, who were believed to watch over and protect the home and its inhabitants. The Penates, the guardian spirits of the family's storeroom or pantry, who ensured the household's material prosperity, and the Genius, the personal guardian spirit of the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, whose personal well-being was seen as being essential for the well-being of the entire family. Every day the family would gather at the Lararium to make small offerings of food and wine and to say a prayer, a daily ritual that reinforced the piety and the unity of the family. The archaeological remains of these thousands of household shrines, with their small terracotta statuettes of the gods and their delicate, painted images, provide a deeply personal and moving insight into the lived, everyday reality of Roman religious belief, a world in which the divine was not a distant and abstract concept, but a constant and intimate presence in the heart of the home. The rich and diverse religious landscape of Pompeii, from the monumental state temples to the humble domestic shrines, is a perfect reflection of the layered and multifaceted nature of the Roman worldview, a world in which a person could be, at the same time, a patriotic citizen of the Roman state, a devoted initiate of an exotic mystery cult, and the pious custodian of their own unique family traditions. The accumulated body of evidence from more than 2 centuries of excavation and scientific research at Pompeii and the other Vesuvian sites has created a historical and archaeological resource of almost incalculable value, a resource that has fundamentally and permanently reshaped our modern understanding of the Roman world. The city's unique and catastrophic fate, while a human tragedy of immense proportions, has provided a gift to posterity, a gift of knowledge and of intimacy with the past that is unmatched by any other site from the classical world. The true and enduring significance of Pompeii lies not in its individual treasures, not in any single fresco, mosaic, or statue, but in its almost miraculous completeness. It is a place where the full, interconnected web of a society has been preserved in situ, where the grand, public monuments can be studied in direct relationship to the humble, private homes, and where the material culture of the elite can be compared and contrasted with that of the subaltern classes. This contextual richness allows for a form of deep, holistic historical reconstruction that is simply not possible at other sites, which are, by their very nature, fragmented and incomplete. Pompeii is a laboratory of the Roman past, a place where the general statements of the literary texts can be tested against the specific and often contradictory evidence of the material record, and where the grand narratives of political and military history can be supplemented by the much quieter, but no less important, stories of daily life, of work, of family, and of belief. The city has been a particularly powerful corrective to the traditional top-down view of Roman history that was, for a long time, based almost exclusively on the writings of the elite. The evidence from Pompeii has been instrumental in the development of a more social and economic history from below, an approach that seeks to understand the lives and the agency of the ordinary, non-elite people who made up the vast majority of the Roman population. The detailed study of the city's commercial and craft infrastructure, for example, has revealed the complexity and the dynamism of the Roman urban economy, an economy that was not just based on the agricultural wealth of the landowning elite, but was also driven by a vibrant and innovative class of small-scale entrepreneurs, of shopkeepers, of artisans, and of freedmen, former slaves who had gained their freedom and who played a crucial and often very successful role in the city's commercial life. Similarly, the study of the city's domestic architecture and its rich epigraphic record has provided a much more nuanced and detailed picture of the Roman family and the roles of women and children within it. While the legal and literary sources present a picture of a society that was overwhelmingly patriarchal, the evidence from Pompeii reveals the significant and often very public role that women could play in the economic and social life of the city, with many women owning and operating their own businesses or acting as the powerful and influential priestesses of important local cults. The graffiti, in particular, with its thousands of individual voices, has done more than any other source to repopulate the Roman world with real, complex, and relatable human beings, transforming our understanding of the past from a dry and abstract study into a living and deeply human story. The influence of Pompeii extends far beyond the specialized world of classical archaeology and ancient history. The rediscovery of the city in the 18th century was a major cultural event that had a profound and lasting impact on the art, architecture, and decorative arts of the modern Western world. The beautifully preserved frescoes and the elegant, classical forms of the city's domestic interiors were a revelation to the artists and designers of the Enlightenment, and they became a primary source of inspiration for the development of the neoclassical style. The delicate, ornamental grotesques and the flat, monochrome color fields of the Pompeian Third style were widely imitated in the interior decoration of the grand houses of Europe and America, a style that came to be known as the Pompeian style. The city became an essential stop on the Grand Tour, the educational journey through Italy that was considered a rite of passage for any wealthy and cultured young man of the period, and the images of Pompeii, disseminated through a vast number of engravings and travelogues, became a fundamental part of the educated Europeans' visual and cultural vocabulary. This cultural fascination with Pompeii has never faded. The city's dramatic and poignant story has been the subject of countless novels, poems, paintings, and more recently films and television documentaries. It has become a powerful and enduring symbol, a cultural touchstone that is used to explore a range of timeless and universal themes. The fragility of human life in the face of the overwhelming power of nature, the poignant contrast between the vibrant, living moment and the cold, silent permanence of death, and the remarkable and almost magical ability of archaeology to bridge the vast, silent gulf of time and to bring a lost world back to life. The final and perhaps most profound significance of Pompeii in the modern world is its role as a powerful and deeply sobering lesson in humility. The city is a tangible and undeniable reminder of the fact that our own complex, technologically advanced and seemingly stable civilization is not immune to the unpredictable and often catastrophic power of the natural world. The story of Pompeii is a case study in the failure of a society to correctly perceive and react to a low-probability, high-impact environmental threat. The people of the first century were not foolish or ignorant. They were intelligent, resourceful, and were the inheritors of a sophisticated and successful civilization. Their fatal error was not one of intelligence, but of imagination. They were unable to imagine that the great green mountain that had been a silent and benevolent provider for their entire history could, in the space of a single afternoon, transform into an agent of absolute and total destruction. Their world was governed by a set of assumptions about the stability and predictability of their environment, and when that environment suddenly and violently deviated from those assumptions, their entire cultural and technological system was rendered instantly and completely helpless. In an age when our own global civilization is facing a series of environmental challenges of our own making, from climate change and sea level rise to the loss of biodiversity, the silent, ash-covered streets of Pompeii offer a quiet but powerful warning. They remind us that the world we inhabit is a complex and dynamic system, and that our own continued prosperity is ultimately dependent on a deep, scientific and unsentimental understanding of that system, and on our willingness to act upon that understanding, even when it challenges our most deeply held and comfortable assumptions about the permanence and stability of our own world. The tragedy of Pompeii is not just a story about the Roman past. It is a timeless and universal parable about the precarious and often fragile relationship between human society and the powerful, indifferent, and ultimately untamable forces of the natural world. As the weight of sleep slowly closes your eyelids, let your imagination wander through the ages in your dreams. If you enjoyed the video, I invite you to like it. There are more boring history stories to help you fall asleep. See you at bedtime. Goodbye.